A slap in the courtroom replaces the prejudices of racism when two white police officers ruthlessly attack a black woman simply because they believe she doesn't belong there. They think they are enforcing justice the right way, but they soon regret it when they witness the moment she puts on the robe, sits in the chair beside the gavel of power, and a nameplate engraved in gold letters, Judge Naomi Ellison, the most powerful person in the city's courthouse. And in the next 5 minutes, everything they've built begins to crumble. Before we continue, I would like to know where in the world you are watching this story from. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss out on inspiring and impactful stories like this one. Harrison Bay was a city that wore its history like old perfume, sweet at first, but suffocating once it settled. The town square gleamed with bronze statues of men who had once written laws with one hand and enforced chains with the other. Its courthouse, a towering neoclassical monolith at the city's heart, stood like a warning. More than a promise, its white columns reaching upward as if in prayer or perhaps in defiance. On that morning, the sun crawled hesitantly through a gray spring sky as Judge Naomi Ellison stepped out of her car and onto the cracked stone sidewalk in front of the building where she'd spent most of her life fighting to be seen, not just as a jurist, but as a human being. 63 years old, tall, dark-skinned, and sharper than the edge of any gavel she'd ever held. Her silver-streaked hair was cut short and practical. No earrings, no makeup, just that fierce, still expression that made people shut up mid-sentence. She'd been walking these marble halls for over 30 years, first as a defense attorney for civil rights cases, then as a federal prosecutor determined to dismantle injustice from the inside. And now, as Harrison Bay's first black female judge to sit on the city's high bench, she carried the weight of both history and expectation like it was stitched into the lining of her coat. That morning, she came in early. She passed through the alley behind the courthouse, a shortcut known only to longtime employees and janitors. Naomi had taken this path for years before the promotion, before the accolades, before the city printed her name in gold above courtroom doors. It gave her time to breathe, to think. Today's docket was light, a routine hearing involving a teenager arrested for loitering and vandalism, a nothing case on paper. But something in her gut told her otherwise. 30 years in law had sharpened her instincts, and today they whispered trouble. The minute she crossed the threshold into the marble atrium, the air shifted. She felt it first in the way the security guards straightened, not out of respect, but alertness. Not one recognized her. She'd removed her name tag years ago. The office knew her by face, not plastic. And now, faced with a black woman in plain clothes, walking briskly and alone through the courthouse lobby before official hours, they fell into old instinct suspicion. "Ma'am," barked a voice behind the scanner, rough and sharp. "You need to slow down. Identification." Naomi turned. The officer speaking was young, early 30s, white high and tight buzz cut. He wore the kind of frown that had been practiced into permanence. "Name and reason for entry," he added. "I'm here for courtroom 3. Naomi said flatly. "There's a matter I'm observing. You're an attorney, number witness no. Then you need to step back, ma'am. This area is for authorized legal personnel only. I am authorized." "That's not how this works," he snapped, stepping in front of her. "Everyone says that. Unless you're a clerk or part of a firm, you don't get access until a judge signs you in, and that's not for another 40 minutes. Naomi's jaw flexed. "I'm familiar with the schedule." That's when Sergeant Victor Huxley entered the scene. Tall, mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, perfectly parted, crisp uniform that looked tailored to his lean frame. His presence carried a different kind of authority, colder and more precise. He took one look at Naomi, and his eyes narrowed not in recognition, but in judgment. "What's the issue?" Huxley asked the officer. "She claims she's supposed to be here, but no ID, no name, no appointment. Says she's authorized. Is that right?" Huxley asked, turning to Naomi like a principal addressing an unruly student. "You here to protest something, ma'am, because we don't allow loitering in this building. Not since last year's courthouse demonstration." Naomi didn't flinch. "I'm not here to protest. Then what are you here for?" he asked, folding his arms. Before she could answer, another voice joined in, an older female clerk carrying a stack of binders. "She was in here last week, too." The clerk muttered loudly enough for all to hear. "I remember the coat." Followed the Carter arraignment, probably another activist trying to make a scene. Another officer laughed. "I don't get why they let people like that waltz in without security checks. No wonder half the cases get derailed. The words landed like stones. Naomi took a slow breath and looked around. No one in the room, not the guards, not the clerk, not even the young black man sitting in cuffs by the wall, seemed to realize who she was. And that was the most dangerous part, because when people think you're nobody, they act like there's no consequence. Huxley took a step closer, face inches from hers. "Let me make this real simple, ma'am. You either produce identification right now, or you're going to be escorted out. You can file whatever grievance you want later." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Is that your standard procedure for courthouse guests?" He sneered. "It's our procedure for uncooperative civilians." Another voice, Dean Carlisle, again chimed in. "Maybe she's here for that kid." He gestured toward the young defendant. "You folks always make it about race until the evidence shows otherwise." That did it. Naomi took one final step toward the security table, locked eyes with the officer behind it, and spoke in a voice like ice cracking across a frozen lake. "I'm going to walk through that door in the next 30 seconds. If you or anyone here tries to stop me, the next courtroom proceeding will not be an arraignment. It will be a formal judicial complaint for unlawful obstruction of a sitting judge. Now, if you'd like to keep your job long enough to retire with dignity, I suggest you step aside." They blinked. Carlisle laughed nervously. "Wait, what?" But Huxley didn't wait. "You threatening officers now?" And with that, without warning, without hesitation, he raised a hand and slapped her. A full, open-handed crack across the left cheek that snapped the room into silence. Time stopped. Someone whispered, "Did he just?" Another muttered, "What the hell?" Naomi stood perfectly still. Her face tilted just slightly, her eyes unmoving, her mouth closed. She didn't raise a hand. She didn't recoil. She simply turned her gaze toward Huxley, like the sky turning before a storm. "You just made the gravest mistake of your career," she said. Then she turned, walked to the courtroom door, and stepped inside. Not a single person moved, not even the guards who finally realized what had just happened, because in 20 seconds they'd all follow her into that room and watch her climb the bench. They'd watch her don the robe, they'd hear the gavel strike, and then they'd remember her name, not as the woman they insulted, not as the woman they dismissed, but as Judge Naomi Ellison, the highest legal authority in the city of Harrison Bay. And from that moment on, none of them would forget it, not for the rest of their lives. Naomi didn't say a word as she stepped through the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 3F. Her cheek still burned, not just from the slap, but from the stench of every word that had come before it, accusations, assumptions, the smirking certainty of men who believed she had no power because she hadn't announced it. Her heels clicked across the polished floor like gunshots in the silence, the courtroom mostly empty this early in the morning, save for a lone teenage defendant in cuffs, a weary public defender flipping through a case file, and a junior court clerk organizing papers at the front. They all turned at the sound of her entrance, unsure of who she was or why she moved like she owned the air. She said nothing. She walked to the side of the bench, to the small private door that led to the robing room, and disappeared behind it like a shadow folding into itself. Outside the courtroom, Huxley stood stunned for a second before the anger rose back to his face like heat off asphalt. He shoved open the door without hesitation, Carlisle on his heels, both of them bristling with authority and indignation they believed was theirs by default. "Ma'am, this isn't over," Huxley barked, voice echoing across the chamber. "You do not get to walk into a courtroom you don't belong in and start threatening officers. I don't care who you think you are." Naomi re-emerged before he could finish, this time wearing her judicial robe. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She moved with the precision of a clock winding into place, every fold of black fabric settling on her shoulders like smoke made of iron. Her eyes met his as she adjusted the front of the robe, and she said absolutely nothing. Carlisle's face began to shift, confusion cracking through his arrogance like hairline fractures. "Wait, what's going on?" he asked, voice no longer sharp but small, unsure. Huxley blinked as Naomi turned away from them, walked calmly up the steps to the judge's bench, and reached for the nameplate resting at its edge. With careful fingers, she picked it up and placed it at the center of the bench, the engraved letters catching the fluorescent lights like a blade catching moonlight. Honorable Naomi Ellison, Circuit Court Judge. She sat down. The gavel rested beside her hand. Still, she did not speak. The shift in the room was tectonic. The clerk froze mid-page. The public defender slowly set his file down. The young defendant, no more than 15, with skin the color of honey and eyes like storm clouds, watched in stunned silence. Huxley stepped back once, then again. Carlyle's lips parted, but no sound came out. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the desk before her, and at last she spoke, her voice so controlled it made the silence quake. "This court is now in session," she said. Huxley's voice broke through again, but this time it was ragged thin. "I didn't know. I didn't realize you were." Naomi's eyes locked onto him, and whatever words he thought he had dissolved on his tongue. Her gaze didn't scream. It didn't need to. It was the look of someone who had been stepped over too many times, someone who had swallowed slights and smiled through disrespect for decades, someone who had waited her entire life for a moment like this, not to humiliate, but to expose. The pain on her cheek was nothing compared to what boiled beneath it, a fury that didn't burn, it smoldered. She turned to the bailiff, Officer Stiles, who had entered quietly through the side. "Please document the presence of Sergeant Victor Huxley and Officer Dean Carlyle." Naomi said, her voice a surgical scalpel. "Note that both entered this courtroom uninvited, attempted to eject an individual they assumed did not belong, and verbally assaulted said individual before and after a physical altercation." Stiles nodded, blinking rapidly, clearly recalibrating her entire sense of the room. Naomi turned to the stenographer. "Let the record reflect that this judge was struck in the face by an on-duty officer in this courthouse without cause or provocation. Let it further reflect that said officer continued to verbally confront the presiding judge after the assault." Huxley opened his mouth again, but Naomi raised a hand. "Just one. Palm open, firm, final. Don't," she said softly, but unmistakably. "You've done enough." Carlyle stepped forward. "Your Honor, I swear to you, I didn't know you didn't care to know," she said. "There's a difference." The courtroom had gone deathly still. Even the defendant, still in cuffs, leaned forward slightly, watching with something close to reverence. Naomi rose slowly, her robe falling into place like a curtain before a reckoning. "I have walked these halls longer than you've worn that badge," she said, her eyes now on both of them. "I've argued in these courtrooms, prosecuted in them, and judged in them. I have watched men like you patrol the edges of power like you owned it, not realizing it was lent to you. Conditional, temporary, and now that power is being revoked." She turned to Officer Stiles. "Sergeant Huxley is to remain in this courtroom under immediate administrative detainment. No cuffs for now, but he is not to leave this building without clearance from Internal Affairs. Officer Carlyle is to submit a full report on his involvement and prepare for internal review." Stiles nodded again, firmer now. Naomi looked out across the courtroom. Her voice softened but did not lose its edge. "What happened here today is not rare. It is not an anomaly. It is what happens when assumptions replace facts, when uniforms replace judgment, when a black woman without a robe is seen not as a judge, but as a problem to be removed. But today this courtroom will remember that justice does not come from fear, and it does not answer to bias." She sat back down, picked up the gavel, and struck once. "Court is in recess." And this time, no one dared say a word. Naomi didn't return to her chambers right away. She remained seated at the bench long after the courtroom had emptied, long after the public defender led the teenage boy, Marcus Daniels, out through the west corridor, and long after Officer Nora Stiles gently guided Sergeant Victor Huxley to a side alcove under temporary detainment. Officer Dean Carlyle had been dismissed for the day, pending his written statement, though Naomi suspected someone like him would be meeting with a union rep before sunset. She watched the door close behind them, then sat in the quiet that followed her fingers, resting gently on the edge of the gavel, not clenching it, not wielding it, just remembering. The slap still echoed inside her skull, not the sting of it, but the silence that followed. That silence had been louder than the strike itself. It had been filled with everything she'd known her entire career, the disbelief, the restraint, the aching truth that she could be the highest-ranking legal authority in the room and still be seen as trespassing, still be considered a threat before a leader. The clerk had already left, awkward and apologetic, and for a brief moment, Naomi let the performance drop. She leaned forward, elbows on the bench, eyes closing as she exhaled a breath that felt like it had been waiting 20 years to come out. But she didn't allow herself to sit in it for long. She stood, smoothed her robe, and made her way to her office, heels echoing off the hallway tile like the ticking of a countdown. Her chambers were dim lit only by the gray light spilling through the blinds. She hung up her robe with steady hands, then checked her messages. 5 new voicemails. 2 from court administration, 1 from the police liaison, and 2 from unknown numbers. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a slim leather notebook she hadn't used in years, a gift from her late husband inscribed with her initials in fading gold. She turned to a blank page and began to write. Not a statement, not yet, just impressions, names, details, dates, truths that needed anchoring before someone tried to rewrite them. Then came the knock, sharp, precise, not a clerk's knock. Not administrative. It was the kind of knock that came with a badge behind it. Come in. Naomi said, voice already composed. The door opened, and in walked Chief Judge Harold Mathers, tall, white, late 60s, with the air of a man who had learned how to command rooms long before he ever earned the right to. His tie was immaculate, his hair carefully combed, and his face unreadable. He closed the door behind him. Naomi. She stood. Chief, you've caused quite a stir. I didn't cause anything, she replied. I was assaulted. He nodded slowly, hands folding in front of him. Yes, that's what I'm here to discuss. She gestured to the seat across from her, but he didn't sit. There are already calls coming in, he continued, from the police union, from city legal, from the mayor's office. They're concerned. Naomi met his gaze. Concerned that a sitting judge was physically assaulted by a uniformed officer in her own courtroom. His face didn't change. Concerned about what happens next. I imagine they are. You know how delicate these things are. Naomi let out a soft laugh, dry as dust. Delicate, a woman gets slapped in front of witnesses and cameras, and suddenly it's delicate. You've made a powerful statement, he said evenly, and you've backed them into a corner. But Naomi, you need to think carefully about your next steps. Her eyes narrowed. You're not here to support me. You're here to contain the fallout. He didn't deny it. There are conversations being had, he said. Discussions about whether this needs to go beyond internal channels, whether it serves the city for this to become a public spectacle. Naomi stepped around her desk, slowly closing the distance between them. Let me be clear, Harold. I will be filing a formal complaint. I will involve internal affairs. And if this city decides to protect the men who did this instead of the office I represent, then I will take it to the Department of Justice. This isn't a spectacle. This is survival. Mathers' jaw twitched. You'll be making enemies. Naomi tilted her head. I didn't know I had any friends left. He sighed, something behind his eyes, finally cracking. They're going to come after you, Naomi. Not just the union, the machine, the ones who liked you better when you were quiet, when you were safe. I've never been quiet, she said. I've just been strategic. He nodded once curtly, then turned to leave. Then I suggest you stay that way. The door clicked shut behind him. Naomi stared at it for a long moment, then returned to her chair. She sat, opened her notebook again, and underlined one word 3 times exposed, because that was what had happened. Not just to her, but to them. Huxley Carlisle, the union, the city leadership, the structure that had for so long moved like clockwork behind a curtain of protocols and polite denials. And now that curtain had slipped. They weren't just trying to erase her authority. They were trying to remind her of her place. And she was going to remind them slowly, surgically, irrevocably what happened when you underestimated a black woman who still had her pen, her robe, and her rage intact. She picked up her phone, dialed the number from memory. A woman answered on the second ring. FBI Field Office, Agent Layla Okoro. Naomi didn't hesitate. This is Judge Naomi Ellison. I need to report an incident, and I need to request federal oversight. Agent Okoro paused. We've been waiting for your call, Judge. Naomi nodded, though no one could see it. Good, she said. Let's begin. The meeting with Agent Layla Okoro didn't happen in Naomi's chambers. That would have been too exposed, too easy to interrupt. Instead, they met at a small federal field office tucked behind a DMV on the east side of Harrison Bay, the kind of place no one looked twice at, where the walls were beige, the coffee stale, and the silence government-issued. Layla was already waiting when Naomi arrived, mid-30s. Sharp suit, tighter eyes. A black woman who had learned the same rules Naomi had, just on a different field. She didn't waste time with small talk. She slid a folder across the table, its label, clean and cold. Internal subject, Huxley Victor J. There's already a file on him, Naomi asked. Layla nodded. More than one. 3 official complaints, 2 civil suits settled quietly in a disciplinary review that vanished off the books in 2019. Vanished how admin override. Someone higher up scrubbed it. No trace in digital logs, but we've got a paper trail that suggests external influence, possibly from the DA's office. Naomi's jaw tightened. Carson Rayburn, the same. Layla opened another folder. And you'll want to see this. It was a list. Not long, but damning. 6 defendants. All black. All minors. All arrested by Huxley over a 4-year period. 4 of them had pled out within 48 hours. 2 had filed complaints, both withdrawn mysteriously within a week. Naomi stared at the paper like it had teeth. Why hasn't anyone done anything, she asked. Layla didn't blink. Because in Harrison Bay, the system isn't broken. It's working exactly how it was designed to. There it was, the sentence that sat like smoke in Naomi's lungs. The unspoken truth she'd always known, but rarely heard said aloud. She leaned back in the stiff metal chair, the edges digging into her ribs, and closed her eyes for one long breath. When she opened them again, she was no longer the woman who had been slapped in a hallway. She was the woman who was going to burn that hallway to the ground. Who else is tied to him, she asked. Layla pulled a final sheet from her folder. We're still digging, but one name keeps coming up in the redacted footnotes. Sergeant Franklin Keene. Retired, worked narcotics with Huxley for 5 years, then quietly transferred to training division before disappearing with a full pension and no exit interview. His name appears on 2 of the complaints that vanished. We think he mentored Huxley, maybe protected him. Naomi nodded slowly. I remember Keene. He testified in a corruption case back in 2012. Shaky witness. Didn't hold up. We've also got whispers of a closed-door meeting between Keene Huxley and D.A. Rayburn last year. No minutes, no scheduling records. But 3 phone calls were logged between their numbers in a 24-hour span after a juvenile suspect ended up hospitalized with no charges filed. Which suspect, Naomi asked. Name was Matthew Cray, 17, picked up for loitering. Body cam footage from the arrest never uploaded. He was in a coma for 3 days. Naomi's hands balled into fists on the table. Where is he now? College? Somehow. Family never spoke publicly, probably got paid. Naomi stood. I want every case where Huxley made the arrest, especially involving minors. Every one. Layla nodded, already flagged. Naomi turned toward the door, then stopped. What about Officer Carlisle? Layla raised an eyebrow. New. No complaints on record, but there's something. She slid over a tablet. A paused frame from Naomi's courtroom taken from the security camera. It showed Carlisle standing behind Huxley just after the slap. The look on his face wasn't shock. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. He knew, Naomi said quietly. Maybe not exactly who you were. Layla agreed, but he knew what was happening, and he didn't stop it. Naomi nodded once, then again, as if confirming something to herself. What about video? Is the full hallway footage secure? Already downloaded to our encrypted servers, Layla said. Twice. Then we go public. Layla hesitated. That's not standard protocol. Neither is slapping a judge in her own courthouse, Naomi said. If we wait for protocol, they'll bury this with PR and procedure. We get ahead of them. We control the narrative. Layla watched her for a long moment, then gave the faintest of smiles. You know, most judges would have called their lawyer and ducked out the back by now. Naomi didn't smile back. Then it's a good thing I'm not most judges. By the time Naomi returned to the courthouse, her desk had already been cleaned of the morning's clutter. A sealed envelope waited at the center, no return address. She opened it with the letter opener her husband had given her when she got her judgeship, a brass blade shaped like a feather. Inside was a single photograph. Her nephew Elijah, age 13, backpack slung over one shoulder, walking home from school 2 days ago. No note, no signature, just a word scribbled across the back in block letters, enough. Naomi stared at the photo for a long moment. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge, crinkling the corner without tearing it. Then she reached for her phone and called Layla again. They've started, Naomi said, voice low and steady. Layla didn't ask what. I want protection for my family. Federal level. Immediate. Done. Naomi hung up, then pressed another number. This is Judge Ellison, she said. Get me U.S. Marshals, now. Across the city, someone thought they were sending a warning. They didn't realize they had just triggered the war. The press conference wasn't supposed to happen, not according to the mayor's office, not according to the court's communications director, and certainly not according to the police union, who had spent the last 48 hours frantically working back channels, making calls, whispering to journalists, leaking just enough to confuse, but not enough to convict. They wanted the narrative to soften, to shift, to become a misunderstanding, a procedural misstep, maybe even an unfortunate overreaction by a judge under pressure. But Naomi Ellison had no interest in playing their game. She wasn't here to soften the story. She was here to sharpen it. It was held on the front steps of the courthouse under gray skies and the weight of a city that could feel the ground moving. Reporters packed the plaza like carrion birds smelling blood, microphones outstretched like claws. Behind Naomi stood a short lineup of quiet allies, Agent Layla Okoro, arms crossed and jaw set, two federal marshals in dark suits and mirrored sunglasses, and Marcus Daniels' public defender, who hadn't spoken to a single outlet, but now stood solemnly with his client's case file, tucked under one arm like a shield. There were no politicians present, no city officials. No one from the DA's office, just Naomi, and the truth she refused to let die quietly. She stepped up to the podium without notes, without prepared statements, and looked out over the rows of blinking lenses and expectant eyes. Her face was calm, but it wasn't neutral. It was tight with something coiled and ancient. Not rage, not grief, something deeper, an inheritance of knowing. "I've served the city of Harrison Bay for 32 years, she began. As a public defender, as a prosecutor, and as a judge, I've seen injustice in its many forms, loud and subtle, violent and polite. I've seen how systems don't collapse from corruption, they thrive on it, until someone names it." She let that settle. "On Monday morning, I was physically assaulted in this very courthouse by a uniformed officer. I was not in my robe. I was not at the bench. I was simply a black woman walking through a space where they did not expect power to live." The murmurs started low, but they rippled. "The officer who struck me has a documented history of complaints of misconduct, of targeting young black men with excessive force. None of those complaints were ever brought to public light, until now. And they were not buried by accident. They were buried by design." She paused. "I am naming that design." Behind the cameras, a reporter raised her hand. Naomi nodded. "Judge Ellison, are you saying the police department conspired to protect this officer?" "I'm saying the conspiracy is bigger than one department," she said. "The district attorney's office, internal review boards, prior command staff names we've trusted to guard justice have instead guarded each other. And when those names come out, and they will, this city will have to decide what kind of justice it really believes in." Another voice. "Do you believe your race was a factor in the assault?" Naomi's eyes sharpened. "I believe my race was the only factor that mattered to him in that moment." There was a long, aching silence, a truth too uncomfortable to argue with. Then came the question they were all waiting to ask. "Are you recusing yourself from the Huxley investigation?" Naomi leaned into the mic. "No," she said. "I am escalating it." Gasps, camera clicks, a low boom of murmurs. "I have requested formal federal oversight of not only this case, but every closed internal review tied to Sergeant Victor Huxley. I have submitted a motion to unseal sealed complaints and to reopen trials where evidence was suppressed under his testimony. This is not about one slap. This is about every voice that went unheard before it." A man from a local conservative station shouted, "Are you trying to bring down the police department?" Naomi didn't blink. "I'm trying to bring down the wall that protects abuse." And with that, she stepped away from the podium. Layla was already moving. The federal marshals closed in behind her, but the cameras kept rolling. They followed her back up the steps, through the doors, through the history of a courthouse that had never seen a reckoning this sharp walk through its veins. Back inside, Naomi returned to her chambers and locked the door behind her. Her heart was hammering not with fear, but with focus. She sat at her desk and opened her drawer. The leather notebook was still there, its pages now filling with connections, Keene, Huxley, D.A. Rayburn names that were never supposed to be in the same room, now appearing on the same lines. And then a new name. A whisper Layla had dropped just before they left the field office. Chief Judge Harold Mathers. It made sense. The soft warnings, the carefully worded doubt, the pressure to back down masked as mentorship. She underlined his name. She was still writing when her phone buzzed. No caller ID. She answered anyway. "You think you're safe behind cameras," said a man's voice. Flat, southern, familiar. But cameras stop rolling, and some things don't make it to air. She said nothing. "You've made enemies, Naomi. The kind that don't show up in court. The kind that don't file motions." Still, she said nothing. "Walk away," the voice said, "while you still can." She hung up. She didn't flinch, didn't move. Instead, she reached into the bottom drawer of her desk, pulled out a fireproof envelope marked "In the Event of Silence," and placed it on top of the folder labeled "Huxley Complaints Sealed." Then she picked up her pen, because if they wanted her quiet, they were going to have to bury her under every page of truth she planned to make public. And Naomi Ellison had no intention of being quiet. The call came at 6:12 a.m. just as Naomi was finishing her third cup of coffee and reviewing the sealed complaints Layla had delivered the night before. She recognized the number instantly, not from any contact list, but from a decade of silence, a decade of knowing which numbers only dialed when things began to slip. Mayor Walter Granger, white, 61, veteran politician, a man who'd built his entire reputation on being just progressive enough to get the minority vote, but not enough to lose the donor class. Naomi didn't let it ring twice. "Judge Ellison," she said flatly. Naomi came the mayor's voice, warm and careful, like a hand hovering just above your shoulder, comforting until it wasn't. "I want to start by saying how deeply disturbed I was to hear about what happened to you. That should never have occurred. And I'm glad to hear Internal Affairs is already involved." There was a beat of silence, and then the pivot. That said, he continued, "Things are escalating quickly. There are press inquiries, legal questions, even whispers from the governor's office. This has the potential to divide the city in a way we may not recover from." Naomi stared at the wall, eyes fixed on a crack in the plaster she'd never noticed before. "I'm not responsible for the division, Mr. Mayor. I'm only holding a mirror up to it." "Naomi," he said again, softer this time, almost pleading, "you have more power than most people in this city, but power used too sharply becomes a blade. I'm asking you not as a politician, but as a friend. Ease off. Let the review process work quietly. Let the system correct itself, for the sake of stability." She closed her eyes and let the silence hang. Then she replied, voice low, lethal, "Stability built on silence isn't stability. It's complicity. And I've already bled too much for this city to start whispering now." The mayor's tone hardened. "If this becomes a media circus, it already is," she cut in. "And if you think I'm going to let the press define me, then you've forgotten who raised me." She hung up without another word. By noon, the first headline hit the airwaves: Judge Naomi Ellison accused of bias in past civil suit allegations of anti-police rhetoric surface. It spread fast. Local outlets picked it up first, followed by national blogs, then cable news. They referenced a 2007 discrimination case where Naomi, then a prosecutor, had dismissed evidence submitted by a white officer due to procedural inconsistencies. The suit had been thrown out. Her record cleared the decision upheld, but the implication was enough. They didn't need facts. They just needed smoke. Naomi sat alone in her chambers, watching the coverage, her face a portrait in stillness. Across the ticker tape of the screen, her name slid by in bold letters, framed with words like activist judge racial agenda, anti-law enforcement. Her nephew Elijah had to be pulled from school early. Her sister called in tears. Naomi didn't blink. She didn't shout. But something inside her, something deep and ancient, began to harden. That afternoon, she issued a public statement calling for a formal televised hearing to address systemic misconduct within Harrison Bay's police and prosecutorial network. The statement didn't mince words. It named names. It referenced sealed cases. It cited dates, departments, and failures. And it demanded public accountability. The next day, an old name reemerged from the past one that hadn't crossed Naomi's lips in years, but had never really left her life: Chief Justice Arnold Kinley. 70. White, towering in presence, silver hair swept back like a monument to old ideals. He had been her mentor in law school, her advocate during her earliest years on the bench, the one who called her "my brightest promise." But he was also the keystone in a very old wall, one that had never cracked, never shifted, never let anyone new in unless they learned to speak its language, obey its rhythms, and kneel when necessary. He called her into his private chambers at the state courthouse. The room smelled like cedar and ghosts. Naomi stood tall across from his desk, refusing to sit. "You've made quite a mess," Kinley said, not looking up from the file on his desk. "I've uncovered one," she corrected. He finally met her gaze. His eyes were the same color as old steel, faded but still sharp enough to cut. "You're pushing too fast, too far. The truth doesn't have a speed limit." "Naomi," he said, and the way he said her name was a reprimand disguised as concern. "You're not just challenging men. You're challenging foundations. These are people who've served this state for decades. You're setting fire to legacies." She didn't flinch. If those legacies were built on fear, then let them burn. He closed the file slowly, deliberately, and leaned forward. I protected you once when it mattered, when no one else would give you a seat at the table. No, Naomi said softly. You gave me a chair but told me not to speak. Kinley's voice dropped. You think you're starting a revolution, but revolutions don't end with applause. They end with exile, disbarment, regret. Naomi stepped closer just enough for her shadow to touch the edge of his desk. Then I'll take exile over silence, and I'll sleep just fine. She turned to leave. Naomi, he said again, one final time, don't mistake conviction for invincibility. She paused at the door, not looking back. I don't need to be invincible, she said, just undeniable. When she returned to her chambers, there was already a package waiting anonymous, no return address. Inside a flash drive, on it raw footage of police body cams that were never meant to see the light of day. Edited clips, missing timestamps, conversations that contradicted sworn testimony. Attached was a note handwritten in tight all-caps print. You want to burn the house down, here's your match. Naomi plugged it in, pressed play, and watched the first 20 seconds unfold. Then she picked up her phone and called Layla. They're running scared, she said. Good, Layla replied, then keep chasing. Naomi leaned back, fire flickering behind her eyes. I'm not chasing, she said. I'm cornering. The next day, the photo came folded inside a plain manila envelope slid under Naomi's office door sometime before dawn. No return address, no fingerprints, just one image creased at the corners and smudged at the edges. Her nephew, Jaden Ellison, 13 years old, his backpack slung over one shoulder, walking home from school. The timestamp at the bottom was from 2 days earlier, and on the back, scrawled in thick black ink, were 3 words written in all caps, stay in line. Naomi stared at it for a long time, not in fear, not in shock, but with a quiet that bordered on dangerous. She ran her thumb along the edge of the photo, then picked up her phone and called Agent Layla Okoro. They've made contact, she said. What do you mean, they're watching my nephew? They want me to know. Layla didn't ask for clarification. She didn't say, calm down, or are you sure? She just said, where is he now? With my sister. Mount East neighborhood. They don't know anything yet. Give me the address. I'll have marshals there in 20 minutes. Make it 10, Naomi said, her voice tight. And I want eyes on them at all times, school, home, everything. I'm not negotiating this. You won't have to. Layla answered. We've already pulled up their profiles. I'm assigning someone I trust. Naomi hung up, but her hands didn't move. Not for a full minute. Then she picked up the photo again, held it to the light, and let the moment etch itself into her bones. They had moved from institutional pressure to personal threats. It was no longer about smearing her name or protecting the old guard. This was about control, fear, leverage, and they had made the gravest mistake of all. They went after her blood. She pulled a contact from a drawer in her mind she hadn't opened in years and dialed. The voice on the other end answered on the third ring, gravelly familiar, laced with memory. Yeah, Elias, she said, it's me. A pause. Naomi, that's something. Been a while. I don't have time for nostalgia. I need your help. I need you to do what you do best. Which part? Break a story wide open. Elias Kane was her ex-husband and still the most stubborn investigative journalist south of D.C. They hadn't spoken in nearly 5 years, not since their divorce settled into the kind of cold silence that leaves both sides slightly hollow. But he was still smart, still dangerous, and still a man who hated systems that devoured truth. I take it this has to do with the courthouse thing, he said. It's bigger, she said. They're watching my nephew. They've started erasing files. They're trying to bury me before I bury them. You got anything verifiable? I've got video, internal footage, raw body cam dumps, off-the-record intel from a federal agent, and a name, Kinley. There was another pause, this one longer. You sure you want to burn that bridge? He asked. Kinley's not just a man. He's an institution. Then it's time someone remembered that institutions rot too, Naomi said. And I'm not burning a bridge. I'm detonating it. I'm in, he said. Send me what you've got. Within an hour, the files were encrypted and transmitted footage from Courtroom 3F showing Huxley's slap in unedited Clarity surveillance logs mysteriously absent from the police database complaint records dating back to 2011 that had been sealed under public safety exceptions. Naomi didn't stop there. She included a voice recording she'd managed to pull from the courthouse audio system, the one where Huxley, not knowing he was being picked up by a hot mic, had muttered, "She thinks that robe makes her bulletproof, but it comes off like anyone else's." By mid-afternoon, Elias had published the first story on his independent site, The Slap Heard Around the State, how one judge's silence exposed a culture of control. It was raw, detailed, relentless. Within 2 hours, it had been picked up by 3 syndicates. Hashtags began trending hash. Ellison reckoning hash, slap of truth hash, justice doesn't he flinch. That night, Naomi sat in her home lights, dimmed a single lamp casting a pool of amber across her desk. Her sister had called 3 times. Jaden was safe, confused but unharmed. U.S. Marshals now shadowed him to and from school. Naomi hadn't told them about the note. Not yet. She didn't want fear to reach them before justice did. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Elias. "You've started something. This is spreading faster than I thought." She typed back, "Good. Let it spread like fire." Then came the knock. Not a soft one. Not polite. This was sharp. Demanding. She opened the door to Agent Layla Okoro, her trench coat still wet from rain, a folder under her arm, in urgency in her stance. "We found something," Layla said, stepping in without waiting. "One of our techs found a mirrored drive connected to the city's internal network, encrypted but cracked. There's more footage, not just you. Other judges, other arrests, suppressed complaints. Dozens." Naomi didn't speak. Layla opened the folder and laid it out, images, transcripts, audio logs. They've been covering up systemic misconduct for years. Not just Huxley, not just Carlisle. This is a machine. Naomi looked at the document's eyes, scanning the names like reading a eulogy in reverse. "Then we dismantle it," she said, "brick by brick." Layla gave her a tight nod. "But they're not done coming for you. We intercepted chatter someone tried to trace your ex-husband's IP. They know the leak came from you." Naomi didn't blink. "Let them know I'm not afraid to bleed for this." Layla exhaled long and slow. "You're not just taking on a department judge. You're taking on a legacy." Naomi closed the folder. "Then I'll bury it next to every lie they built it on." Outside, the wind howled down the city blocks, tearing through streets like something alive. Inside, Naomi sat in the center of it all, steady as a fault line. And somewhere in the shadows of power, someone finally realized they hadn't silenced her. They'd unleashed her. The hearing was set for 10:00 a.m. sharp, but by 8:30 the federal courthouse in downtown Harrison Bay was already teeming with bodies. News vans crowded the sidewalks like vultures circling fresh truth, their antennas raised to the sky, soaking up every whisper. Protesters stood shoulder to shoulder with citizens' attorneys and survivors, their voices merging into a rising tide of demand justice, accountability, no more silence. The air felt charged, too quiet in places, too loud in others, as if the entire city had paused, waiting for something sacred or savage to begin. Naomi arrived through the side entrance under escort, not in silence, not in secrecy, but in deliberate, measured purpose. She wore dark navy, not black, no robe, no bench, just a tailored suit and a storm behind her eyes. The federal marshals flanked her like sentinels, not because she asked for protection, but because the government finally understood they had failed to provide it before. When she entered the marble halls, heads turned. The reporters didn't yell questions. The onlookers didn't shout praise. They just watched as if seeing history walk past, unshaken and undeniable. Inside the chamber, the seats were full journalists, with recorders already running, legal observers, with pens twitching, community members, with worn-out hope stitched into their sleeves. At the head of the room sat the presiding federal judge, Honorable Karen Lucero, a woman of few smiles and fewer indulgences. Naomi respected her. She didn't need to win Lucero over. She just needed the record to be clean, official, and inescapable. When called, Naomi rose from her seat and stepped toward the microphone. The room fell into a hush that didn't come from reverence, but anticipation. This wasn't just a hearing. This was a reckoning. Before we begin, she said, her voice low and carved from stone, "I am formally recusing myself from direct judicial oversight of the case regarding Sergeant Victor Huxley. As the victim of the assault in question, my continued jurisdiction poses a conflict, at least on paper." Lucero gave a slow, respectful nod. Naomi continued. "However," she said, eyes sweeping the crowd, "I am submitting an emergency request to elevate this matter to federal jurisdiction. Not just the case of my assault, but the wider pattern of systemic obstruction, abuse of power, and judicial compromise that has infected this city's legal infrastructure. Murmurs rippled, cameras clicked. Naomi opened the folder in her hand. Not thick, not dramatic, just enough pages to set fire to a decade of secrets. In the past 10 years, she said, reading each word with surgical calm, 6 Harrison Bay officers have been accused of excessive force, wrongful arrest, or misconduct involving minors. None were prosecuted. Internal reviews were either dismissed, sealed, or lost. She placed the first page down. 3 assistant district attorneys have been directly linked to cases where crucial evidence disappeared. 2 of them received commendations during those periods. Another page. 2 sitting judges signed off on dismissals involving coerced confessions and falsified testimony, one of which led to the wrongful incarceration of a 17-year-old boy whose record was expunged quietly, but whose trauma remains. The 3rd page dropped onto the pile like a final nail. Each of these names, she said, is tied to one another, not by law, but by loyalty, by a system that protects itself before it protects its people. And standing at the center of that web is one man, Chief Justice Arnold Kinley. Gasps scattered like shrapnel through the courtroom. Naomi didn't blink. A man who mentored me, who once championed my appointment to this very bench, and who on multiple occasions used his influence to suppress internal audits, block external review, and preserve a culture of discretion over transparency. Kinley wasn't in the room, but his shadow was. I have no vendetta, she said, only memory. And memory, when aligned with evidence, becomes truth. Lucero sat still, eyes narrowed, hands folded. One of the federal prosecutors leaned toward her, but stopped when she raised a single finger. Keep listening. Naomi stepped back. The room inhaled. She looked to the crowd now, not the court. She saw faces, some hopeful, some haunted, some afraid to believe that this moment could lead anywhere but disappointment. To those who say this hearing is political, she said, voice rising just enough to carry, I say this justice has always been political because power has always decided who gets it and who doesn't. Today we decide differently. She turned to Lucero. I submit this report under federal request to be entered into the National Judicial Review System. I ask for immediate investigation. I ask for transparency. And I ask for the weight of the law to fall finally, not on the vulnerable, but on the ones who made vulnerability a weapon. Lucero nodded once, slow and precise. Motion entered. The court will review your documentation and deliver its ruling on jurisdiction within 24 hours. Naomi stepped down, but the record had already spoken. As she walked back to her seat, Elias, her ex-husband, was already typing the live feed of the hearing being broadcast to over 400,000 viewers and counting. Jaden, watching from a secure federal site, would later tell her he'd never felt prouder. And Chief Justice Kinley, watching from behind closed doors miles away, picked up a phone with trembling fingers, not to stop what had started, but to try and contain what could no longer be denied. Because the world now knew the truth, and Naomi Ellison had made damn sure they couldn't look away. A few days later, Huxley's trial also came. The courtroom was packed to its legal limits, and then some. Federal marshals lined the back wall, the air thick with press advocates, officials, and the quiet gravity of history unfolding in real time. This wasn't just a trial. This was a dissection of power, of silence, of the machine that had churned uninterrupted for decades until one woman refused to look away. The United States v. Sergeant Victor J. Huxley charges assault of a federal judge, obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, under color of law, and conspiracy to conceal misconduct. But the real charge, the one no statute could fully name, was betrayal. Betrayal of oath of community of the trust every citizen places in the badge they're told to respect. Huxley sat at the defense table in a dark suit that looked too tight across the shoulders, his jaw locked in defiance, but his eyes had lost their edge. They darted too much. He knew. He wasn't the only one on trial. He was the tip of the spear, the face the system had chosen to sacrifice in the hopes the body would survive. When the prosecution called Officer Dean Carlisle to the stand, the room stilled in one collective inhale. He hadn't been subpoenaed. He'd volunteered. No one expected it. He took the oath with shaking hands. Officer Carlisle, the prosecutor, began, "Can you describe your role on the morning of April 9th during the events in Courtroom 3? Carlisle nodded slowly. "I was on internal security rotation with Sergeant Huxley. We were responding to a report of an unauthorized individual moving toward restricted space. That individual was later revealed to be Judge Naomi Ellison. The attorney nodded. And what happened next? Carlisle's eyes flicked to Naomi briefly, then returned to the jury. I stood by while Sergeant Huxley confronted her. I didn't say anything. I didn't stop it. Why not? Carlisle swallowed hard. Because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. He paused, then went on, voice cracking at the edges. I want to be clear. When we first saw her, I didn't recognize her. She wasn't in her robe, but I also didn't ask. I assumed. And when Huxley got physical, I froze. Not because I was confused, but because I'd been trained, maybe not officially, but socially, not to question the chain of command, not to challenge men like him, and not to protect women who looked like her. The courtroom didn't breathe. I believed I was just following protocol, Carlisle said. But really I was following fear. Fear of stepping out of line. Fear of ending up like others I'd seen transferred, isolated, broken down. I thought I was a good cop. But in that moment, I was just another gear in the machine. The silence was deafening. Even Huxley turned to look at him, not with anger, but something like betrayal. When Carlisle stepped down, he didn't look at Naomi again. He didn't need to. The apology had already been spoken. Then came her turn. Judge Lucero called Naomi to the stand, and for the first time in her life, Naomi took an oath, not as the one who presided, but as the one who testified. She sat tall, composed, not righteous, just resolute. Judge Ellison, the prosecutor, said, "Can you describe what happened on the morning in question?" Naomi nodded. I entered the courthouse through a public entrance because the staff entrance was under maintenance. I was not wearing my robe. I was not carrying identification. I was in appearance a black woman in civilian clothes walking unaccompanied through a public government building. She paused, and that was all they needed to decide I didn't belong. The courtroom was still. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the echo of her words. When Sergeant Huxley confronted me, I remained calm. I identified myself only by asserting my right to be present. I didn't shout. I didn't escalate. I didn't threaten. And then he struck me. Do you believe he would have done the same if you were white or male? Naomi looked directly at the jury. No, I believe he didn't strike a stranger. He struck what he thought was beneath him. He struck silence. He struck anonymity. He struck every black woman who had ever walked into a room and been told without a word that she was trespassing in a space her ancestors had built. Her voice didn't shake. It sharpened. There is a difference between law and power, she said. Law is a structure. Power is a choice. Law is blind. Power chooses who to see. What happened to me was not a breakdown of law. It was the exploitation of power. And it didn't start with Sergeant Huxley. It started long before him. He is not the system, but he is what the system produces when left unchecked. The defense declined to cross-examine. Judge Lucero called for recess. By noon the next day, the verdict was in. Guilty. On all counts. Huxley's face didn't crumble. It didn't contort with rage. It simply fell like a man who had spent years building a fortress and just realized it had no foundation. The marshals took him quietly. No cuffs in front of the cameras. Just a door closing behind him. And a legacy imploding. But the verdict was not the climax. It was the breach. Because with it came the flood, an emergency review board launched by the Department of Justice, 42 cases flagged for investigation, 2 assistant DAs placed on administrative leave, and the early retirement of Judge Arnold Kinley for health reasons. A wave of resignations swept through the Harrison Bay Police Union leadership within a week. Community hearings were announced, oversight committees formed, no longer symbolic, no longer suggestions. Naomi stood on the courthouse steps the day the verdict was read, not to speak, not to perform, but just to be seen. By the people, by the press, by the ones who had waited too long to believe something like this could happen. Elias stood beside her, silent. Jaden watched from home. And for one brief moment, the city that had tried so hard to make her invisible saw her not as a symbol, not as a controversy, but as a mirror. And in that mirror, they saw the truth. Not pretty, not perfect, but finally real. The letter was handwritten, not typed, not emailed. Naomi had always believed that endings like beginnings deserved the dignity of ink. It sat atop her desk in a sealed envelope, marked with nothing more than a signature and a date, Naomi Ellison, May 14th. The resignation wasn't a retreat. It wasn't a concession. It was a choice. one made not in defeat, but in defiance of the idea that she had to wear the robe until it swallowed her. She had fought the system from within for decades, and now, with the verdict read, the machine exposed, and the country watching it, was time to hand the baton to someone who wouldn't have to bleed just to hold it. Her announcement came 2 weeks after the verdict. No fanfare, no televised press conference, just a short statement delivered before the Judicial Oversight Committee. "I am stepping down, not because I lost," she said, eyes clear, voice unwavering, "but because I've won the right to choose how I serve next. I will not stand in the glow of a fire I lit. I will make room for others to carry the torch without having to burn to prove they belong." Some protested, some praised. But Naomi didn't stay to listen. She packed her chambers herself, books first, then letters, then the tiny brass gavel paperweight her husband had once given her on the day she took the bench. "You won't always get to swing the real one," he'd said, "but keep this close to remember you still carry the weight." She left behind her robe neatly folded in a wooden case, sealed with the words, "For the next her," and then she went home. Not to the city, not to the courthouse, but to Mount East, a quiet suburban edge where trees bent low and wind moved like memory. Her sister's house sat on a corner lot with a wraparound porch and flower boxes Jaden refused to water until bribed. Naomi took the guest room, but rarely stayed in it. She preferred the porch, the sound of tires on gravel, of life stripped of litigation. It was there on a soft June afternoon that Jaden came home from school, dropped his backpack by the door, and climbed the porch steps 2 at a time. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside her, their legs barely touching, the kind of comfortable silence that only comes from blood and trust. He held a crumpled flyer in his hand. His school was doing a mock trial competition, and he'd signed up. "I saw you on TV," he said after a while, voice smaller than usual. "My teacher said you made history." Naomi smiled. "Your teacher's smart." Jaden stared down at the paper, then looked up at her, something deeper flickering behind his eyes. "Did you change the world?" She didn't answer right away. She looked out across the street at the way the sunlight caught the tops of the oak trees, at the breeze bending the grass without asking permission. Then she turned to him, her voice soft but certain. "No," she said. "I just broke the door." Jaden tilted his head. "What door? The one they kept locked? The one they told people like us wasn't ours to walk through?" He was quiet, thinking. "So, who opens it?" Naomi leaned in, pressed her palm gently against his heart. "You do," she whispered. "You're the one who opens it." Jaden blinked, then smiled just a little. A smile that didn't fully know what it meant yet, but somehow understood it mattered. They sat like that for a long while, watching the day lean into evening. No deadlines pressing, no headlines waiting. Naomi wasn't a judge anymore, but she had never been more certain of her judgment, because justice, she had learned, isn't a job title, it's a legacy, and she had finally made space for it to grow. The story of Judge Naomi Ellison is not just a courtroom drama. It's a testament to what happens when a woman refuses to bow to silence, when truth is no longer whispered behind closed doors, but spoken boldly into microphones for the whole world to hear. Her journey from being misjudged in a hallway to holding a corrupt system accountable on the national stage is a reminder that justice is not something given, it's something demanded, fought for, and sometimes paid for with the scars of dignity held firm in the face of power. Naomi showed us that real strength doesn't come from status or uniforms or even titles. It comes from the courage to stand alone when it would be easier to fall in line, from the quiet rage that builds bridges for others instead of burning out in bitterness, and most importantly, from the will to not just survive the system, but to change it. She walked away not because she was finished, but because she wanted to make space for a new generation that wouldn't have to fight the same wars she did. She chose to let her story be a foundation, not a monument. And in doing so, she reminded us that the most powerful thing any of us can do is be the beginning of someone else's breakthrough. So now we ask you, if you were in Naomi's shoes, standing in that courtroom, feeling the weight of silence and the sting of injustice, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet, or would you have made them listen? Tell us in the comments below, what did this story make you feel? Have you ever witnessed something unjust but didn't know how to speak up? Or maybe you did speak up and your voice made a difference. We want to hear your truth. And if this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or even cry, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful, meaningful stories to light and spread these messages to those who need them most. Because change doesn't come from one person shouting into the void. It comes from all of us choosing to speak, to share, and to stand together. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And most of all, thank you for believing that stories, real, raw, and unapologetic, still matter.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.